Now let's use what we learned about creating textures in the previous lesson to create 5 commonly used textures. We'll go ahead and open our primitives PSD and we'll add these textures to our 3D primitive objects. So let's start with a stone or a rock texture and we'll add that to the cube. We'll start with the front side of the cube. I'll choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Ctrl-Shift-H and create a new layer. Go ahead and choose Multiply for the composite method, choose a dark gray color. I'll select the sponge, and I'll tap a few times to put in some texture here. Make my brush smaller, put in a few smaller spots here and there. Create another new layer, call it Front Text L, that's short for Texture Light. I'll set the composite method to Screen. I'll choose the chalk brush. Let's use the flow map for the dab stencil. Then let's choose a paper grain. We'll choose Artist Rough Paper for 1. And for the flow map, we can go ahead and choose Clouds. Let's see what kind of stroke we get there. I think I want my flow map to be bigger. And I want my contrast to be higher on my Artist Rough Paper. Maybe that's too big for the flow map. Something like that will work. And I, of course, want to select a lighter color as well. Play with the scale of the paper and the flow map. And so now I have one side. I'll go ahead and just group these by side. That'll help me better organize my layers, and I'll go ahead and do the top next. Just to make things easier and more efficient, I'll just call this layer dark. This will just be the dark texture. I want to use those same colors and same techniques. So I want a bigger brush in the foreground, smaller brush in the background. That way I get the illusion of perspective. Create another new layer. Set that to Screen. Select my chalk brush and my lighter color. And decrease the scale of my flow map and my grain to get the illusion of perspective. Now if I need to play with the opacity of those layers to get them to blend in better, I can do that. Because the top side is catching the most light, I want the dark areas to be noticeably lighter than they are on the dark sides. Let's go ahead and group that top side, and now we can do the far side. So I know I'm creating lots of layers here, but that gives us lots of room for flexibility as well. So go to the dark color, select the sponge, bigger brush in the foreground, smaller brush in the background. Go to the light layer, select the chalk, increase the scale, that way I get bigger in the foreground, decrease the scale, so I get smaller in the background. And then of course I want to reduce the light quite a bit so it's not as noticeable. And now we have our basic stone texture for our cube, but we're not done yet, because now we need to enhance things by adding in a few fine details here and there using the Detail Oils brush. So I'll create a layer on top of all the other layers. And here's where we can go in and we can enhance some things by putting in some little cracks and crevices. You can paint along the edge to give a bit of a drop shadow to make it look like it's bulging out. Or you can add a light area if you want it to look like it's elevated up off of the surface. Adding in a few details like this here and there will help break up the pattern, and it'll make it look more like there's some deeper and more elevated areas in your stone texture. You could also accomplish this by using an image hose brush. I could create a new layer, set it to overlay, and I could pull up one of my image hose nozzles, like Cracked for instance, select an image hose brush, and I could paint in some little cracks here and there. It saves me a bit of time. Let's try another brush. Let's try Lumpy. Now if we want to apply this to all sides of the cube without it spilling off the edge, what we'll need to do is select the cube group, and then we'll go to Select Group Content. That puts a selection around all the layers. That way when we go in here and we paint, it's not painting off of the object. So we can add in the lumpiness, we can add in some metal bumps, and all of a sudden we have this nice additional texture that we added to our object here. Adding some beveled texture also works really well for capturing that stone effect. Let's go ahead and just create a new layer for that. I'll just call it Bevel. And let's try one of these papers in the Painter 2015 papers. Let's try Big Bumps. And you can play with the contrast settings and the scale. Let's go ahead and pick a nice bright color that we can see. That way I can see where I'm adding this texture. I'm also going to make sure that it's not inverted. We should get something like that. So these are not going to stay blue, but I'm making them blue so that I can see them easily on the background here. So these are going to be holes. Let's go ahead and turn on Preserve Transparency, and let's fill them with a dark gray color. Now, because this is not a very complex bevel, you could try to do it with Bevel World here in Corel Painter, but I'm going to go ahead and use Photoshop. I've already saved this as a PSD, but you could do that by going to Save As and choosing PSD for the format. And then I'll just open that PSD here in Photoshop. So I'm going to go to that bevel layer, I'm going to zoom back into my cube here, and I'm going to go down to the bottom of the Layers palette, choose the Live Effects button, and go to Bevel Emboss. Pillow Emboss is really what I want here because I want there to be some little holes in my stone, but you could use Outer Bevel if you want these to be raised bumps. Inner Bevel can give you interesting results sometimes, as well as Emboss. Let's do Pillow Emboss. I like the way that looks. We can play with the size if we want it to be more smooth or sharper. I can make it smaller. We want to make sure our light's coming from the correct angle, so we'll want to adjust our lighting there a bit. I think something like that will work. If you want control over the color of the highlights and the shadows, you can control that here. Typically, you'll want to leave this as white and black, and the highlight mode as screen and the shadow mode as multiply. We can also play with the size if we want to make it smoother or sharper. I think I like sharper better. There's also a technique you can use, Chisel Hard, which gives you a harder edge, or Chisel Soft. I'm going to go with Smooth. I think that looks pretty good. You can also increase and decrease the brightness of the shadows and highlights here with the opacity as well. If I want it to look more shiny, I can increase the highlight. If I want it to look more dull, I can decrease it. So I think something like that looks pretty good to me. If we do a before and after, you can see the effect that it's having. We want to make sure that we go ahead and apply this effect. So what we can do is we can go to File, Scripts, and then Flatten All Layer Effects. And then we can go ahead and just save again to save our PSD. And we'll open it back up in Corel Painter, and we have that nice bevel effect. I'm going to go to that bevel layer, and I'm going to add a mask to that layer. I'm going to select black. Then I'm going to select the airbrush. Because on this far side, I don't want it to be quite as dark, so I'm going to knock it back by masking it a little bit. And now you can see it blends in much better. If I wanted to do that on the top side, I could as well, since that's catching a lot of light. We'll do a before and after, and you can see that adds a lot of texture and character to that stone, and that's very easy to do. Now, even though the color of this stone is going to be mostly gray, I do want to add a little bit of discoloration because maybe the stone has dirt on it. So let's take a look at how to do that. We don't necessarily need to do this on a separate layer for each face like we've been doing with the texture. We could actually just apply this to the whole cube. And to do that, we're going to do something very similar to Select Layer Content, except we're going to select the content from all of the layers in this group. That's known as Select Group Content. So with the group selected, we want to go to Select Group Content. That puts a selection around everything that's in that group. And we can go ahead and add a new layer. We'll want to move it down into the top of that cube group, to the very top here. And we can just call that Dirty. We can hide our selection while keeping it active by hitting Ctrl-Shift-H. We'll change that dirty layer to Multiply for the composite method. And let's pick a dirt color. Now we can use either the chalk or the sponge. It's really up to you what brushes you want to use. Maybe I'll use the chalk along with that same big bumps paper texture there. And I'll increase the scale of that texture as well, and we'll put in some of that here and there. Let's change our dab stencil to flow map, and let's choose a very large clouds flow map. Let's put in a little bit of that as well. Let's experiment with some other brushes. Maybe we'll try stencil flow map messy dab. Let's shift our hue towards yellow a little bit and put in a slightly different brown color. And if we want, we can add a mask to that dirty layer. Select black, and we could use the sponge or really just any of the texture brushes to mask away some of that. What that's doing is that's kind of putting a texture upon the texture. And I think something like that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and right click on our masks and let's choose Apply Layer Mask. And we'll zoom out and take a look at our cube. So far, so good. Now the last step to complete this stone effect would be to make some chips and some of the edges here. So let's go to the top layer, that's this layer here, and let's select the Distorto brush. And with a small Distorto brush, we'll go right on the edge here and we'll put some chips in it. So I'm just going to paint a little notch shape straight down like that. There's a little chip there, maybe one there, and just kind of dent the edges a little bit to make them more irregular. We can do that on the front layer as well. We can dent that in a little bit in a couple places. That just helps the edge look more like it's actually stone. And I think with that, we have a pretty convincing stone effect. Let's move on now to sand. I'm going to deselect that selection that was surrounding the cube with Ctrl-D. And let's add the sand texture to the plane. I'm going to right-click on the plane, choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Ctrl-Shift-H, create a new layer. We'll call this Sand Base. When I'm adding sand and dirt, I like to add a base color with just a little bit of subtle texture. That can be on a multiply composite method with a dark gray color. Use the sponge, as we looked at earlier, to make our texture smaller and smaller as it goes into the background. Now, because I have the big bumps paper texture selected, I'm getting a more broken result than I would normally get if I was just using basic paper. So I'm going to switch to basic paper. And I'm just going to go over this with basic paper as well, because I want the whole thing to be covered with texture. Then I'll reduce the opacity of that to where it's just kind of subtle. So you could think of this as the dirt that's going to be underneath the sand. I'll create another new layer. We'll call this Sand Fine. Let's select Screen for the composite method here. And then I'll select the Pixel Spray brush. And I want to select kind of a lighter gray like this. Make a pretty big brush. We'll just paint over the whole thing. And we don't need to worry about scaling our brush bigger or smaller in this case because these are just 1 pixel dots, so they can't get any smaller than that. Let's brush over the whole thing like so. We can select an even lighter color and put that near the light source there, radiating out from it. And we can reduce the opacity of that layer. Let's create another new layer. We'll call this Sand Large. This time we'll use the pepper spray brush. We'll set the feature to 2. Smaller feature means a smaller speckle size. We'll select a light gray color. And this time we want to just click with our mouse using a large brush like so, because if you use your pen, chances are it's going to spray out at an angle and it's going to spray out too much. But what I want to do is I just want to click all over here just to add some little sparkles. These are little grains of sand that are catching the light. Because what is sand? Sand is little bits of rock and glass. So it's going to be reflecting the light and catching a lot of highlights. Make my brush smaller and then concentrate it around the light source. I'm going to put in some as well. Might even select white for that. That way those really stand out. Make my brush smaller as I get near the light source. Now you can feel free to reduce the opacity of that layer as well until you find a blend that you like. I think that's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to adjust some of the layers a bit, such as the sand base layer. I'm going to reduce the opacity of that a bit. I'm going to bring up the opacity of the Sand Fine. On the Sand Fine layer, I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency. I'm going to select black. I'm going to select the airbrush. And as we're moving away from the light source, that sand should be getting a little bit darker and catching less light. So what I'm doing essentially here is just darkening the sand that's moving away from the light, or the sand that's furthest away from it. So the little speckles are there, they're just darker here and lighter as they move towards the light source. Let's add another layer at the top of the plane group. I'm going to call this Ripples. I'm going to turn off Preserve Transparency, and I'm going to select an image hose nozzle here. Under Textures, we have Fabric Ripple. I'll select that. I'm going to select the Linear Size P Angle D image hose brush, and we want to paint with downward strokes like so, because that way our highlight will be facing towards our light source. Make my brush bigger as I move into the foreground. And we'll set the composite method for that layer to overlay, and we'll reduce the opacity of it to where we get just a subtle amount of rippling. And if you see any spots that stick up too much, you can always go in with your diffuse blur and simply just blend those out. There's a few little smaller lumps there. Blend those away. You could think of the diffuse blur as just flattening out your sand. So there you go, now we have a nice sandy effect. If we want to go ahead and give that sand some color, we can do that. We can create a new layer. We can call that Color. Typically when you're adding color, a multiply composite method works well. You could also try the color composite method. Let's try multiply. Pick kind of a sandy color, and we will fill with that color. You can feel free to hunt around for another color if you see something you like better. I'll go with that and click on OK. So there you go, we have a pretty convincing sand effect now. Eventually I will add an environment color to this scene, and we'll add some environment colors to our textures and objects, but we'll do that towards the end after we've added some basic texture to each of these. Now let's move on to the next style of texture, and that will be wood. And as you might have guessed, the wood is going to get applied to the cylinder. So let's go ahead and zoom into that. I'll right click on the cylinder, choose Select Layer Content, hide my selection with Ctrl-Shift-H and create a new layer. And really this is as easy as just going in with something that you would use for creating a rock texture, such as light and dark colors using one of these fractal style brushes here. Could create another layer for screen, and maybe for that I'll use the chalk brush. And let's use that big bumps paper in a lighter color. We'll put in some big bumps. Reduce the scale of those bumps, and we'll put in some finer ones here and there. We'll reduce the scale of that flow map as well. Go back to that darker layer, put in a few darker spots. And once we have something like that, then we just need to blend it. I'm going to go ahead and right click on the cylinder layer, and I'm going to duplicate it. Then I'm going to merge my screen, my multiply, and my duplicate cylinder layer together. Hold Shift to select them, and then I'm going to hit Control E to merge them. So now I have my texture separate from my cylinder. Now I can simply go in with any of my blenders that use grains, such as Coarse Oily Blender, or the Oily Blender, or Speckle Drip Smear, Grainy Drip Smear. Let's try Coarse Oily Blender. Let's switch to the regular basic paper. That'll give us longer streaks. And then we start to get something that looks kind of like wood grain. And again, you want to try to be as vertical as possible with your strokes. If your cylinder is going vertically, if it's going horizontally, then you want it to go horizontally. Something like that's kind of starting to look like wood. And you could turn on Preserve Transparency and you can keep layering this up. I can keep adding patches of dark color over this if I want to, and then simply just keep blending it like so until it looks the way I want it to. Now in blending, I ended up pulling in a lot of light area over here where my shadow should be. So similar to how I did it on my cube earlier, I need to make sure that if there's shadow areas on the cylinder, there needs to be shadow areas on the texture as well. So I'm just going to select a dark color like this, and I'm just going to paint right over that area so that that texture in that area is in shadow. Next, I'm going to select the Diffuse Blur Blender. Use a bigger brush, and with light pressure, I'm going to pull again, following the contour of the wood in the cylinder there. That smooths it out and just makes it a little bit softer and helps it look a little more like wood. If you wanted a rougher wood effect, you could, of course, forgo that light blending. Blending near the edge creates some white fringe, so you have to watch out for that. What you can do to fix that is simply select the Distorto brush and just pull that fringe straight down to get rid of it. Over here on the side, I might need to push it away like so. So I think that'll work for the wood texture. Let's go ahead and add some color now. We'll choose the cylinder group. We'll turn off Preserve Transparency, and we'll go to Select Group Content. I also have shortcuts up here for Select Group Content and Select Layer Content. I'll hide the selection with Control-Shift-H. We'll create a new layer at the top of the cylinder group. Let's go ahead and select a wood color. Something like this will work. We'll want to make sure that we set the composite method to multiply. We could also try color. I think multiply looks a little more convincing. Now if this is a wood stump, then the top of the cylinder needs to be a different color. So let's right click on the top layer. Let's choose Select Layer Content. Let's click back on the color, and let's hit Control-X to cut it. And then we'll want to paste it in place. The shortcut for that is Control-Shift-V, but I've changed my keyboard shortcut so that Control-V does paste in place. Because most of the time when I'm pasting something, I'm going to want it to paste wherever I cut it from. If you just use regular paste, then it ends up somewhere else. So what I've done is I've cut that color, put it on its own layer. We can turn on Preserve Transparency, and then we can pick a different color here. And we can hunt around until we have an appropriate color for the top of the wood. Something like that will work. We can call that layer Color Top. Let's go back to the Color Top, and we'll want to set the composite method of that layer to multiply. Now let's go back to the top layer. That's just the layer that's underneath the color. Let's turn on Preserve Transparency. We'll select kind of a medium gray color and the Detail Oils brush. Starting in the center, we'll draw kind of a spirally pattern here, because wood on the inside has rings, and so we just need to imply that. We don't need to make it super detailed or anything. But just here and there, add some little circular lines. You could even use lighter colors in a couple areas if you feel that that helps it stand out better. And we can zoom out and see how that looks. I think we'll also go right along the edge with the Detail Oils and enhance the edge, because normally on the edge when you cut a piece of wood, the edge is a little bit frayed. So we'll just imply that. We go along the top edge too, because that could be catching a little bit of light. Let's go ahead and zoom out and look at it from far away. And I'm not sure that I'm fond of that color that I chose for the top. So the beauty of having all these layers separate is that now I can go to that color top layer. I can go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors. Click on the Reset button because I don't want it to be blue. And I can shift the hue, or I can increase or decrease the saturation. So I think I want it to look more like that.